I always feel like you're the director and you give me the head nod and then action. Good morning. I'm Dave Anderson, and I serve as chair of the Master's Level Psychology Licensed Clinical Psychotherapy Advisory Committee of the BSRB. I ask the members of the advisory committee to respond to a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that is being conducted remotely by conference call and other electronic medium. Donna Honer-Queel.
Present.
Travis Hamrick.
Present.
Rebecca Jabara.
And I don't see her on the call, but we do have another member joining right now. Looks like that's Rebecca, just joined by phone.
Yeah, sorry, I'm having computer issues. So I just decided to, while I'm waiting for my computer to, join me today, I decided I would not leave you guys hanging.
Thank you.
Very good, thank you. Lauren Locke.
I don't see her on the call yet.
Okay, Iris Pauley.
Present.
Joshua Tangway.
Present.
And Kari Wold.
Present.
I note the following BSRB staff members are also present. David Fye.
Here.
Leslie Allen.
Here.
Next, David Fye will read a message concerning this meeting being held remotely.
This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about its concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, does not require the advisory committee to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no public comment at this meeting as no individuals requested to provide public comment. Because we are conducting this public meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is being conducted by a medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and on the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of the KOMA are not suspended, so we will be conducting this meeting pursuant to the KOMA. On May 22nd, 2023, we sent notice of the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who had requested notice of advisory committee meetings. The notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other media material have been posted on the board's website and are available for review. You may also request a copy of the agenda by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and the YouTube channel that allows the members of the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if there are any technical issues during the meeting, you may call the board office at 785-296-3240 or send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And the conference call line is active. I did check it before the meeting started, and there's no one currently on the conference call.
Thank you, David. The meeting's now called to order. The advisory committee will begin its discussion. The first item on its agenda. So first thing we have is to approve the agenda for today's meeting. Are there any additions to the agenda? If not, I would accept a motion to approve the agenda.
Move to approve.
Second.
Josh? Donna, was that you? Very good. We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Very good. Next, we'll do a review and approval of the minutes from our advisory committee meeting on April 12th. Has everybody had an opportunity to review those? Are there any additions or modifications to the minutes? All right, I would accept a motion on the minutes.
I would move to approve.
Thank you, Donna. A second.
Second.
Travis, thank you. All right, we have a motion and a second. Further discussion? All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Hand gestures also accepted. Thank you. Any opposed? Same sign. Very good. We'll move now to the executive director's report. Dave.
Thank you, Dave. So I'll start with some updates in terms of operations, specifically in the realm of IT. We are working behind the scenes to implement a lot of the provisions from a newly passed bill that passed this legislative session with some items related to the BSRB. That is a sub for Senate Bill 131. And I'll go into a little bit more detail, the specific items that were included in that bill that passed. But just to let you know, when something like this does happen, there's a lot of back end work to make sure that we can roll out the different items in the bill. There are forms that need to be updated. There are new forms that need to be created. We have another state agency who hosts our licensure system. And so we need to work with them to make sure that they can enable things in the system for us to physically issue some of the new things that are created. And so we're working on some of those things behind the scenes, but really excited about some of the items that are going to be available once that bill becomes effective, which is the next fiscal year. So that would be after July 1st. But I'll tell you a little bit more about the bill as we kind of go through some other legislative updates. Additionally, under some operations updates, as part of that bill that passed, we received authority to hire 2 new licensing specialists. And so we are working through the logistics of hiring those 2 new individuals and developing position descriptions so that we can spread around the work in the office for those new individuals. And our goal is to make our licensing process more efficient and effective. And also we have some new responsibilities from the bill. So trying to make sure that we can run as smoothly and as effectively as possible. But to hire new individuals, there's several steps along the path. So that's something we're also working on behind the scenes. We do not have authority to make those hires until after the next fiscal year starts, but we're trying to do as much work in preparation for that so that we can have those interviews and have those hires hopefully shortly after the start of the next fiscal year. Additionally, we are trying to follow good standards in terms of our IT practices here in the office. 2 years ago, we started a phase-in approach of moving staff members to new laptops under the state's desktop as a service program. Instead of changing everyone at once, we decided to do a phase-in approach so that we could move the desktops out and have the new laptops, which we'd be able to plug in at people's desks, but would also allow for some movement throughout the office and then potentially some remote work for certain individuals. This year, we're transitioning the last 5 staff members to the new computers. So that'll be something that we'll be doing over the next few months. And additionally, we were able to apply for a couple of different grants in the area of IT. There was some Spark funding that was made available to state agencies to apply for modernization of technology. And so we applied for some grant funding to replace the projector in the boardroom, which would allow us to have more efficient and effective hybrid meetings. And then we also put in some funding request for an OWL camera. And if you're familiar with those types of cameras, it allows for a 360-degree camera. So you can have it in the middle of the conference table and it can pick up everyone around the table without having to have multiple cameras in the room. And we've used that for a few different board and at least one hybrid advisory committee meeting, and it's really nice and effective. And so really pleased with those and appreciative that that funding opportunity was made available. And because that we received that through the federal dollars, that is a savings we were able to have through the for the agency. In terms of some legislative updates, I'll start with the BSRB budget. So the BSRB as a fee-funded agency, we don't receive money directly from the state for our operations. We function primarily off of licensing revenue that we collect based on the licenses that we issue. We have a fund where that's all collected, and the role the legislature serves in the budget process is they ask us questions, review our planned expenditures, and they can make adjustments to our budget. They essentially set a limit on how much we can spend in any particular fiscal year, so that even if we had more money than that in our fund, we would be limited to a certain amount each fiscal year. So the way that the budget process works is you submit a revised budget estimate for the current year, which is 2023, and then we submitted a budget request for the next 2 fiscal years, fiscal year 2024, 2025, trying our best to estimate future costs and expenditures. So we submitted a budget. The governor made a recommendation on total expenditures for the agency. and then the House and the Senate consider the budget separately. And so for the Senate side, the bill went to a committee, or the budget went to a committee, and I presented the budget. They asked questions. Ultimately, they decided to recommend what the governor had recommended for expenditures for each of the 3 fiscal years with no additional changes. On the House side, in the Budget Committee, they asked questions about some items that were included in a bill, policy bill that the board had requested be introduced. One of the items in that policy bill had to do with a new requirement in continuing education in the area of cultural diversity. And so even though it was a budget committee, when I'm at the podium, they could ask me questions about anything, and they asked questions about the items in that bill, and specifically about that new proposed requirement of continuing education and cultural diversity. And in that budget committee, when they worked the budget, they recommended the same amounts the governor had recommended, but they added language to the agency's budget for fiscal year 24 and 25 that's called proviso language. And provisos basically either say that the agency has to spend money on a particular purpose, or the agency is prohibited from spending money on a particular purpose. In this case, the proviso language basically would say for those 2 fiscal years, it would prohibit the BSRB from requiring as a condition of licensure or renewal, education, training, or education in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion, critical race theory, or other related topics. And so that was added to the budget. And I think the intention or the effect would be that if separately in a different committee, if the bill passed with that provision for the continuing education, the budget proviso would prohibit us from enforcing that as a new requirement for licensure. They discussed if that proviso should stay on the budget. Ultimately, they decided that it should stay. It moved to the Appropriations Committee. The Appropriations Committee discussed it further, decided that it should stay, and ultimately it was passed in the House version of their budget bill. The Senate separately passed a budget bill, and they came together to decide items of difference. When they did that, they ultimately decided to keep the proviso on the BSRB budget, and then they passed the appropriations bill. Then they left for a period of time to allow the governor to review all the bills that had passed. And during that time, the governor has authority to make vetoes, and specifically for appropriations bills, the governor can do line item vetoes. So the governor can veto specific portions of bills. And so for the appropriations bill, one of the line item vetoes that she did was this proviso language relevant to the BSRB. When the legislature came back for the last days of the session to wrap things up, that's a period called omnibus. So when they came back for that omnibus period, they had the opportunity to attempt to override vetoes, and they considered the veto on the BSRB budget in the House first, and ultimately by 1 vote, the veto override attempt failed. And so ultimately that means the governor's veto on the language stands. So that language is not attached to the BSRB budget for fiscal year 24 or 25. I realize that's a lot of detail and it's a little bit confusing, but there's been a lot of movement with this item and there's been a little bit of confusion about it. So I just wanted to let you know where that currently stands. While there was a lot of discussion, there was a lot of movements. Ultimately, now that the session has wrapped up, that proposed proviso language is not going to be on the agency's budget for fiscal year 24 and 25. And I think I'll pause here for a second just to see if you have any questions about that item. Okay, if not, I'll move on to the next item in terms of legislative updates. As I mentioned, there was a significant bill that passed this legislative session relevant to the BSRB. It had a number of items the board had requested, and then it had some additional legislative changes that the legislature went ahead and added to that bill. It started out originally as a House Bill 2340. And I think at our last advisory committee meeting, I had provided an update concerning that bill moving through the process. It originally went to the House committee, and the House committee made changes. Ultimately, it went to the Senate committee, and the Senate committee passed the bill with some one additional change. And because there was an item of difference, ultimately what happened is the bill went to a conference committee with the 3 top members of the House committee and the Senate committee, and they could make additional changes. And so that bill also had a lot of movement. But I think what I'll do to make sure that it's not too complicated is just kind of explain the items that were in the final version of the bill, because ultimately the original BSRB bill was put into a different bill in conference committee. And so the item for the BSRB are and substitute for Senate Bill 131. And while there are 2 other bills that are included in that, each of those other bills are about 1 or 2 pages long. So the vast majority of the bill, about 65 to 70 pages, are all items relevant to the BSRB. And so the items in the final version of that bill include a change to most of the reciprocity statutes for the professions. The board had requested a change. So for most of the professions, they have a statute on reciprocity that would say you would need to either come from a jurisdiction that had substantially equivalent license requirements, or you would need to meet alternate requirements. And one of those alternate requirements was to have practiced in another jurisdiction for 48 of the last 54 months. The board requested legislation to change that number to 12 months. And part of the reason was there was a bill that passed a couple of years ago that dealt with reciprocity for military members, military spouses, individuals that reside in Kansas, and those that intend to reside in Kansas. And this 12-month time period is more in line and will avoid some confusion concerning the 2 different time frames for that process. Additionally, the bill includes language that would create a new type of temporary license for graduates of social work programs that are in candidacy for accreditation. That would be for bachelor's and master's level applicants for social work. Their accreditation process can take 3 to 3.5 years. And so there was an issue in that newly created online programs were going through the accreditation process, but their graduates were coming through those programs and the programs were not accredited yet. And that would mean they would have to meet other requirements in our regulation, and some of those programs would not meet that. But the board looked and did research on other states and how they've addressed this issue. There was a model the board adopted that's similar to what they use in Minnesota. And so essentially what the concept is that if someone graduates from a program that's in candidacy for accreditation, reaching those thresholds, but still not accredited quite yet, those graduates can get a temporary license. And then if their program reaches full accreditation, they would be able to get a permanent license. So it's a little bit different than a traditional temporary license, but it would allow them to practice and have a level of licensure to be able to provide services while they're waiting for their program to meet the full accreditation standards. There was also creation of a new student temporary license for the addiction counseling profession. This is the first student temporary license for the different professions, but the Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee had recommended the board consider development of this new type of temporary student license, and it would be for individuals that are seeking the necessary coursework to become addiction counselors, but they are still quite a few hours away, and there would be an agreement with the student and their school and also the prospective employer that they would be able to work under supervision while they're attaining their hours. And so it would allow individuals to kind of get into the workforce a little bit quicker under this new arrangement for these student temporary addiction counseling licenses. Additionally, for most of the professions, the traditional temporary licenses last for 1 year. For a couple, they last 2 years, but for those other professions where the traditional temporary licenses last for 1 year, the board recommended changing that so that newly issued temporary licenses after the bill becomes effective will all be 2 years. And so we had heard that some individuals were struggling to pass the licensing examination, or perhaps they got a temporary license and then had an issue that prevented them from passing the examination within that year period. And so this allows more time for individuals to be able to work while attempting to pass the licensing examinations, and also provides a level of security to employers too. We hope that most people who get these temporary licenses and take the examination will pass on their first attempt. But if that doesn't happen, they'll have more time to be able to work while trying to pass the licensing examination. Additionally, the board was very conscious of workforce issues and worked hard to really try to address these in creative ways. One way was to look at individuals who are currently licensed. Right now, to renew your license, you have to obtain a certain number of continuing education hours each license period. And if you reach the end of your license period and you haven't completed those hours, you're not able to renew your license. And so what has happened in a few cases over the years has been individuals come upon the end of their license period. For one reason or another, they're not able to finish their hours. And so they let their license expire. And one thing the board wanted to do was to provide a little bit of flexibility if someone had an extreme situation that prevented them from finishing their hours, to allow them the opportunity to request additional time from the board. This would not extend their license. It would just allow them to renew their license if they were approved. and it would grant up to 3 months of additional time for them to finish those hours if they could show an extreme situation because of their own health, someone close to them, or another extreme reason why they would need the additional time. And then the board had added some language that they wouldn't be able to use this in back-to-back license periods. This is not something we want people to rely upon frequently, but we want to provide that flexibility to help people stay licensed. And then additionally, the board was looking at workforce in terms of people who were previously licensed and now their licenses have expired. And for those individuals to come back to the professions currently, they need to pay double the license fee, because if you want to reinstate your license, there is a reinstatement fee plus the renewal fee that you have to pay. You also have to get all of your continuing education hours from the previous time period before you can renew. And so what the board recommended was that if someone really had been away for a significant period of time, if their license had been expired for at least a year, then for them to come back and reinstate their license, it would be half the cost as a motivator to try to help people come back to the professions. Additionally, for individuals that have not obtained all of those CE hours but want to come back immediately, the board would create a new type of 6-month reinstatement temporary license. And this would allow individuals to get this special 6-month temporary reinstatement license and be able to work while finishing the CE hours. And then once they had finished those hours, then their full license could be permanently reinstated. So looking at creative ways to help out with workforce, not just from individuals entering the licensed professions, but coming back and then also staying licensed. Additionally, the board made some changes to the statutes in terms of some cleanup. For the licensed psychology profession, there was a change of standard from good moral character to meriting the public trust, which makes it more consistent with the other professions and also with different states. There were some disciplinary remedies for the behavior analyst profession that were not included when that profession was originally created. For most of the professions, there's a statute that identifies the different authority the board has if someone violates unprofessional conduct. For example, for the behavior analyst profession, the board was limited to suspending the license or revoking a license. And so if someone had a minor violation, there was not the same level of appropriate flexibility in terms of the other professions and what they have in their language. So this matches the language up and makes it more in sync with the other professions. And also the language as it was originally written for behavior analysts did not allow the board to reinstate a behavior analyst license. So if their license expired, they would have to reapply. And so one of the items in the bill adds language to allow regulations to be developed for the reinstatement of those licenses. Additionally, I mentioned there was originally a board recommendation for a new requirement of continuing education hours in the area of cultural diversity. The board had put forward a proposal for 3 hours for all licensees, but also did not want to restrict the number of hours that individuals could have flexibility in choosing what CEs they wanted to take. So in exchange for adding this new requirement of 3 hours in cultural diversity, the board also recommended adding language to the bill that would decrease the number of continuing education hours in diagnosis and treatment from 6 hours to 3 hours. And part of that was because in doing a survey of other states, while our 3 hours of ethics is pretty consistent between the different states, the 6 hours in diagnosis and treatment every CE period is a bit unusual. And so the board wanted to serve both roles in terms of making sure that we would have good public protection by putting forward the proposal for the cultural diversity training, but also didn't want to restrict too many hours. And so there was a recommendation to decrease from 6 to 3 the diagnosis and treatment hours, and then to add 3 new hours in cultural diversity. In the legislative committee, what the legislature recommended was removing the language on the continuing education requirement in cultural diversity. So the legislature did take that item out, so it was not in the bill. But the legislature recommended lowering the number of hours in diagnosis and treatment from 6 hours to 3 hours. So essentially that was the choice the legislature made, to lower the number of hours in diagnosis and treatment from 6 to 3, but to not include the new requirement in cultural diversity training. Additionally, as the bill went through the process, there were 3 other items that were added. One had to do with some changes to applicants for the clinical level of social work. The statute had specified 15 specific course hours that applicants for the clinical licensure would need to have completed. And they modified that to strike 4 of the 5 classes to reduce the number of specific hours in those categories down from 15 to 3. And then they made some changes to the language concerning the practicum and also the 3,000 hours of postgraduate experience for individuals seeking that level of licensure. The language currently states that they would have to have 3,000 hours of postgraduate experience, including 1,500 hours of direct client contact, diagnosing and treating individuals. And the new language makes references to the 1,500 hours being including, but not limited to, diagnosing and treating individuals. So we're still kind of working through how to interpret that new standard. And so that'll be a process that we'll be going through. Additionally, the legislature added language to create a new type of license. It's called a community-based license. And I believe we talked about that at the last meeting. When it was originally proposed, these new community-based licenses would last for up to 2 years and would have a similar function as temporary licenses, but would be for individuals under the scope of employment at community mental health centers. And there's a couple other little differences about those licenses. But when the bill went to the conference committee, that was expanded. And originally the proposal had not included the master's level psychology profession, but in the conference committee, that was a profession that was added. And also, instead of it only being under the scope of employment for a community mental health center, it was expanded to also include FHQ. It was expanded to include PRTF, psychiatric residential treatment facilities, alcohol and drug abuse facilities specifically listed in statute, and then one other type of facility. So individuals under this new type of special license would have to show that they were under the scope of employment at those different facilities, and then they would have to be supervised by someone at a clinical level license. And so that is something newly created that was put into the bill. And then also there were some operation changes that were put into the statute concerning the BSRB. So this new language requires the BSRB to essentially have a 15-day turnaround when we receive an applicant material in terms of letting the applicant know if their application is complete or incomplete, and if it is incomplete, what else is necessary for it to be complete. The new language would also require the BSRB to issue a decision within 30 days of a complete application. And then it would require the agency to adapt or introduce rules and regulations to create an expedited license process. And so that is one item that the board will be working on in terms of developing that expedited license process and rules and regulations. And so there were a couple other items that were initially proposed by the board in the original bill. One would have required board approved supervisors for social work, but that item was removed by the House committee. And then another would have added a board member for the behavior analyst profession, but that item was removed as well. So there are quite a few items in this bill. It is a lengthy bill, and the effective date of the bill is July 1st, 2023. So we're working on sending out material to licensees to inform them of all the different changes. Behind the scenes, we're trying to work on identifying all the areas of the agency website that need to be adjusted, all the forms, newly created forms, working with our license, our vendor that hosts our licensing system to make sure we can issue a lot of these new types of licenses and other items. So there's a lot of work to implement these, and we'll probably have to be doing a rollout approach for some of these. But as much as possible, we're going to try to have as many of these things live when the bill becomes effective on July 1st. And then after that, we'll be introducing things as quickly as we can. There's some regulations that are currently going through the process of change. And so that is another thing that's also going on behind the scenes too. But I'll go ahead and pause now. I know that I covered a lot of topics as a summary of that bill, and I'll see if you have any questions on items in that bill.
Any specific questions for Dave? Excellent summary, Dave, and I think it helps the committee understand how complicated it is in trying to get some of these changes made to the statute. I think I've said before, Dave has talked with the full board about, we create kind of a bill in terms of what we want, but once we hand it over, it becomes theirs. And then they do with it, and they being the the legislature what they see fit, and often without further recommendations from the board, although Dave testifies, as he indicated previously, and tries to point out issues where things that they have changed might create issues for licensees and the board, but not always successfully. So once it becomes law, though, it's then Dave and his staff's responsibility to figure out how to make it happen. And so that's, as he indicated, what they're doing right now. And I appreciate the detail discussion about it, Dave, because there is a lot of behind the scenes work that has to happen to make all those things work. And Dave mentioned that it's the Board of Healing Arts that hosts BSRB's licensing process. So we are somewhat, well, not somewhat, we're completely dependent upon them. And they too have had some workforce issues. So it's one thing for a department head like Dave to get his staff ready, but he's also reliant on the staff of other agencies he has no control over as well. So I want to give kudos to Dave and his staff for all their really hard work, all the while doing what they're required to do every day to make sure that people can get licensed. So any questions for Dave? All right, is that the end of your report, Dave, or you have more?
That was the biggest item. I have a couple of small items. I'll just
Go right ahead.
Okay. So in terms of other items, I did just want to mention there has been some discussion about multi-state compacts for the different professions. One other significant bill that passed this session was House Bill 2288. It adds Kansas to a multi-state compact for the professional counseling profession. It would be for the clinical level of professional counselors here in Kansas. And that bill is effective on July 1st, 2023 as well. That compact is a pretty recently started compact, and the commission just started meeting last year. They're still working on the infrastructure for the compact. So once that becomes effective, we will not be able to start issuing items under that compact. What that compact is set up to do is to allow any member states in that compact to be able to get something called a privilege to practice in another compact state, which is similar to a license, but it's not exactly the same thing. But ultimately, once the infrastructure is developed, what clinical level professional counselors would be able to do in Kansas would be, if they wanted to practice in another state, they could apply to the compact commission for a privilege to practice. And if that's a member state, they could get a privilege to practice very quickly and very easily. And that would last for a limited period of time. It would not prohibit them from getting licensure in that state, but it provides another pathway and kind of more of a quicker process to get licensed in any, or not licensed, but have the privilege to practice in any of those compact states. But as I mentioned, the infrastructure is still being worked on by the compact commission. However, even though the bill has not become effective yet, we're able to take some initial steps. So after that bill did pass, the board at the last board meeting appointed board member Laura Shaughnessy, who's the board member for professional counseling, to serve as the compact commissioner for the state of Kansas for that commission. And so she will be attending commission meetings and reporting back to the board concerning that compact, and I'll be assisting her with that responsibility as well. And then Senate Bill 66 passed, which would create a sort of a unified license verification portal for the professional licensing bodies in Kansas. So we currently have a portal on our website where individuals can check to see if someone has an active license. And what this bill does is it's intending to create sort of a one-stop shop where if individuals want to look for a professional license for any of the professions, they can go to this newly created website and be able to identify if someone holds a license in any of the professions. So it will involve us integrating our license verification portal with that system and all the other licensing bodies in the state of Kansas as well. So We will be working with them. I don't know the full detail of what that will involve from us, but I wanted to make you aware of that because it will take a little bit of time for us to kind of coordinate that and make sure that we're linking our system up with them. For agencies that don't have a verification portal, it will create more work in that they will need to make sure that they have an online verification system and be able to provide that information to this new system as well. So we're a step ahead of some of the other agencies in terms of what we have, but we will be assisting them and making sure we're compliant with that bill too. And then I did want to provide an update from the last board meeting. The last board meeting was May 8th, 2023. At that meeting, the following advisory committee members were reappointed to serve another 2-year term on the advisory committee: Rebecca Jabara, Lauren Luck, and Kari Wold. And just as a reminder, advisory committee members serve 2-year terms. And so for individuals who didn't come up this year, their term would come up next year, but they're a staggered system of appointments. And so many advisory committee members were reappointed at that last board meeting. And I did want to recognize the 3 members that were reappointed at that last board meeting and really let you know that we appreciate all the work that you do and look forward to continuing to work with all of you. But I just wanted to say congratulations on your reappointments and look forward to working with you more over the next couple of years. And then I did want to let you know also at that board meeting, the board received proposed unprofessional conduct regulation changes from each of the advisory committees. Over the last year, the different advisory committees have made recommendations on proposed changes. And so I did my best to basically consolidate all of the proposed changes for all 7 professions and put together a mock-up of those different regulations that shows how the proposed changes would be incorporated in each of those regulations. But those were presented to the board, and the board is informed that those would be going back to each of the advisory committees. So the advisory committees could have the opportunity to look to see what other professions had considered and recommended, to see if any of those recommended changes might be helpful for their professions as well. So in your packet of material, you do see a large document, about 42 pages, and it includes unprofessional conduct regulations for all the professions. And so this doesn't need to be an item that you fully resolve today, but it is something to be looking at. And then the goal is by the end of this year to have recommendations forwarded back to the board so the board can make final recommendations on changes to the unprofessional conduct regulations. Also, at that board meeting, the board discussed its plan to hold another offsite annual planning meeting later this year. Traditionally, the board tries to have one in-person meeting each year offsite to allow the board to talk about the legislative agenda and other items they want to put together. And the board expressed their desire to go ahead and have that be in person again this year and either be in late September or in October. And I polled board members. The date of that has now been set. It will be on Monday, October 23rd. The location is most likely going to be in Wichita, but I'm still talking to vendors to try to identify the specific location for that in-person meeting. And then one last update. So board members on the board serve 4-year terms, and they have the opportunity to apply to be reappointed for a second 4-year term. But as things change, board members do come off the board. And so I wanted to recognize 3 board members that will be expected to be coming off the board based on governor appointments and new appointments. Deb Stidham has been serving as the board's addiction counselor, and she is ending her 2nd term on the board. So it's expected that the board governor will appoint a new member for addiction counseling. And then Rick Steele is a board member for licensed psychology, and he is stepping away from the board after serving his 1st term to work on some other items. And Jonna Norton has been serving as a public member, and she's also not seeking reappointment to the board. And so just wanted to let you all know about those 3 board members that will be leaving the board. There's 3 other board members that are up for reappointment. And so I will let you know at the next meeting concerning the governor's appointments. Usually we find those out close to July 1st. And as soon as we know them, we post them on the BSRB website. And so I wanted to thank the board members for their service as well, and just communicate that to you that they would be coming off the board at the end of June. So with that, I will go ahead and end my report and see if you have any additional questions.
Thank you, Dave. Any questions? All right, seeing none, we'll move to old business. And our first item is continued discussion of recognizing APA accredited accreditation from LP programs as satisfying the standards for master's level psychology applicants.
And Dave, do you want me to go into this one first, or do you want to kind of summarize this topic?
Run ahead.
Okay, so this topic originally came up because there were questions about individuals applying for the master's level psychology license who had received their education from APA accredited programs for PhD level programs for psychology. However, the licensed psychology statutes or regulations identify a national accrediting body in which we can move people through that process if they come from a program that is APA accredited. For the master's level psychology, there's only about 17 states that license master's level psychology. And so there's not a widely regarded accrediting body or a national accrediting body specifically for master's level psychology licenses. The regulations don't identify a body that would allow us to say, if you come from a program that's accredited by this group, then we can move you forward through the process. Instead, the regulations have a list of program requirements and also coursework requirements that applicants would need to meet. And so when someone applies, if we have not reviewed that program and found that it met the requirements to approve it in the past, we have an individual or an expert review that program to ensure the person meets. The question that was posed to us was whether applicants for master's level licensure who come from these APA accredited programs, if that should be something that would be helpful to have added to the regulation to allow us to expedite the licensure for those individuals who apply from those programs. And so we had an initial discussion on that last time, and Leslie was on vacation, and so I indicated that she might have additional thoughts on this topic as well. So she and I have had sort of a brief conversation about it, but I thought it might be helpful for her to add some thoughts on that topic as well, concerning what we currently require for master's level psychology applicants, compared to what a change might do if we recognize the APA accreditation as another pathway for licensure for master's level psychology.
Okay, so if we word it properly, that the person it could just be that they graduated from an APA program and that meets the program requirements and the university requirements, but you can still require the specific coursework, and although it always has the coursework and the practicum. But I don't know specifically how many hours of practicum a doctoral student has to complete. That they would be applying when they're going into their internship usually. And I could try to get that from APA, but I don't know offhand how many hours they require.
So Leslie, I think we're mostly, and you correct me if I'm wrong, talking about people who are in APA approved PhD programs, but who receive their master's degree in the course of that and then are applying to be LMLPs. Is that right?
Not all of them have a master's degree.
Okay. So some of them don't have they're not also earning a master's degree.
Right. They
Okay.
just, there's no terminal master's degree in their program necessarily.
Would they then be applying though after completing the second year of their PhD program so that they would have an equivalent number of hours?
They have to have passed their exams in their doctoral program. Hold on a second, let me look it up.
Competency exams.
Competent, yes. So they've finished everything, almost everything except their internship and dissertation.
And do those programs have separate practicums from internships, or do they have just the one
They have,
practice experience.
they have practicums, they have more than one practicum before their internship.
Okay,
But I don't
Travis?
know how many hours that they require, so I have to look that up.
okay. Travis, you had a question?
I think this applies to a number of our interns that come here from doctorate programs. And they work at the hospital on an internship, and they're receiving a temporary master's level psychology license to allow them to conduct psychological tests and to actually perform some of the duties here. I don't believe any of them have the intention to go on and obtain a master's level psychology license, a full one. Is that what most of the people are looking for?
Most of the time, but we do have occasionally people who pass the exam for the LMLP, but they can't pass at the independent level. And so they just want a license at the LMLP level and stay there. So they can practice while they continue to take the exam.
Oh, okay. So even though they have their doctorate degree, they haven't passed the level to obtain an LP, but they can be practiced as a LMLP.
Correct.
Okay.
And again, this issue is specific to those people in APA accredited programs, because we do get other people who are in PhD level programs that are not APA accredited that also try to get licensed as LMLPs, but this would not include that group.
Right.
Other folks have feedback or questions for Leslie?
The purpose of it is for it to be a faster process. I mean, because we used to have PhD interns too, and they always got licensed, and I don't remember it taking too long, but I don't think we ever had any issues with them doing it.
No, because it wasn't being processed properly. They were just approving it because it was APA accredited, and the statute or the regulation doesn't allow that. And so that has come to our attention, and now we're having to question APA programs.
I see.
So Leslie, can you outline exactly what happens currently when somebody in this situation applies?
So currently, if someone applied from a program that was APA accredited, we would have to send the questionnaire from the regulations, asking the program to complete it and return with supporting documentation. It then needs to be reviewed by the expert for education. Then it has to go before the full board for approval. So it slows it down several months.
Does that, is that with each applicant, or is it dependent on whether they're coming from a program you've dealt with before?
We have been, I'm not sure. So each year it could be different. If someone came from the same program, and graduated at the same time, we would know that everything was the same. But if they don't, then we would have to review it again.
So part of the problem is, right, that once they finish the program, and then if they have a high enough score in the EBBB and they apply, because it's accredited, then it skips that whole process. So it's really the fact that they're applying for a master's level, and that means that each time, unless somebody else has come through that program during the same year and you've already verified the program, you have to go through that process again.
Right.
So that's really what this is about, is skipping that process.
Right. And the regulation can, for counselors, their regulation says it has to be K-CREP accredited and meet all the coursework requirements, which includes the practicum. Or they have to meet all the regulation. So it could be written that so if someone wanted to get permanently licensed as an LMLP, they would have to have the same 750 hours of practicum. But by then they will have completed their internship, so they would have all that anyway.
So it could be written in such a way that would essentially mirror what the counselor's regs say.
Yes.
How do you all feel about that? Seems like an unnecessary step currently that is really slowing this process down for some people.
Yeah, I would agree. APA says the average number of hours for practicum in a PhD program is 1,094.
Oh,
I think all the ones that we've had in the past, we haven't had any for a while, but I think they all had at least the 750 for sure.
Anybody feel contrary to that? Okay. So can we recommend that staff write something that mirrors what the counselor reg looks like and bring it back to this group, and then we could review that, move forward? Everybody comfortable with that?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Leslie.
you're welcome.
Next item is the continued discussion of changes to clinical training plans.
And so this item was also, the discussion was started last meeting, and we thought we'd continue at this meeting. This has to do with the regulation 102-4-7A, which is postgraduate supervised professional work experience requirements. And essentially, this has to do with a lot of the supervision that individuals would be receiving when they're seeking their clinical level license. In Kansas, individuals have to submit a training plan, has to be reviewed and approved. And then the item specifically the board wanted the advisory committees to discuss is on the second page of that regulation down in item H, which says all changes to the clinical supervision training plan shall be submitted by the supervisee to the board for its approval. The changes shall be submitted no more than 45 days after the date on which the changes took effect. If a supervisee fails to submit the change to the board within the 45-day period, no supervised hours of practice shall be accrued or credited for any practice beginning on the date the changes took effect through the date on which the changes to the plan were approved by the board. And at the last meeting, there was some discussion. So two items on this. First, the regulation says that all changes to the clinical training plan shall be submitted by the supervisee to the board for its approval. But there has been some confusion by a handful of applicants concerning what types of changes needed to be submitted. And so there was some discussion at the last meeting about specific types of changes that could be added to the regulation to provide more visibility on those items specifically. And then this second item was concerning the 45-day rule that is currently in the regulation, because there have been individuals who have failed to submit a change. And then when they go to submit their hours, because they didn't submit that change, all those hours are lost. And so it has a significant impact to the person who was submitting those hours. And questions that were raised concerned, the ultimate goal of the board in terms of having this regulation. And I believe, the ultimate goal is to make sure that essentially people are doing the right thing, to make sure that they're accruing hours that would meet the regulation. And then also to make sure that that they're not wasting their time, in a sense, doing something that wouldn't meet the requirements for them to get their clinical license. And so I think the purpose and why this was initially added most likely is to make sure that people know they need to submit these changes so that the board staff can review them to make sure that those changes would still be something that would be approved for the purpose of accruing hours. But perhaps there is a better method versus this current language for the 45-day requirement. And so we talked a little bit at the last meeting about the BSRB could send out a notification to individuals who are under an approved training plan every 6 months or so, reminding them that if you make changes, those have to be submitted. We also had discussion about potential specific changes. I did want to share some comments from some of the other advisory committees because all the advisory committees are discussing similar regulations if they have one like this. One of the professions, I believe it was the addiction counseling profession, recommended including some language. Instead of saying all changes, it would say all substantial changes to the clinical training plan shall be submitted by the supervisee to the board, including but not limited to, and then it listed a few there. And so that would provide some visibility there, but also letting them know that instead of it just being all changes, we really are concerned about the substantial changes. And then they discussed the question of, if the hours would have been approved, if they would have been submitted, if these were things that would be acceptable, should this 45-day requirement really restrict the person from counting all those hours? And right now, the language really has some strong language in here that says, those hours shall not be counted. Is there an adjustment to the language that can provide some flexibility so that if someone provides the hours, the board can maybe consider weighing other factors on if the hours should be declined or not? And so what that advisory committee talked about was on a language where it says, if the supervisee fails to submit the changes to the board within the 45-day period, instead of it saying no supervised hours of practice shall be accrued or credited for any practice, it would change that language where it would say the board may decline to count those hours. And so it would basically allow the board some flexibility where they could count the hours, or if it was a substantial change that wasn't reported, the board could decline the hours instead. So kind of wanted to share some of the other discussions by the different advisory committees and open this back up and see if any of you had additional comments or thoughts on potential changes to this regulation.
Dave, what were the few things that they listed for? Do you have that?
Let me go ahead and pull that paper up.
Josh, I had a similar thought, which was more of like substantial could look different for each person. So I think if we had a like just a rough, because people will ask like, well, does this qualify as substantial? So
yeah, so what they had down as sort of a starting point was substantial changes, including but not limited to setting, type of clients, and supervisor. But ultimately, I think, the hope is that the advisory committees would provide some recommended maybe language changes back to the board, and then potentially the board could make a uniform change to each of the regulations so that at least this language would be consistent profession to profession. But those are the three examples they had down, was setting, types of clients, and supervisor.
And even in that, I think to Dave's point, the more precise the language, the less ability the board has to do anything other than exactly what the reg says. And so if a person just went from, let's say, they worked for a large agency and went from one setting to a different setting, but were essentially doing the exact same job, that could nullify their hours if they did not notify the board about that change. And so what we're looking for is to make sure that people who have those plans are alerting the board when there is a substantial change, one that might cause the board to rethink whether that plan is still appropriate, versus a change that has been made, but essentially doesn't really alter the original training plan. And so they don't lose all of those hours and have to, kind of start over on those.
Yeah, and Dave, to your point, the way that the regulation is currently worded, it has some pretty strong language. And so if that is in the regulation, from a licensing body's perspective, we're required to enforce the law or the regulation the way that it's written. And the board is also required to enforce the regulation the way that it's written too. So there's not a great deal of flexibility in terms of interpreting this. There's a little bit, but it would be helpful, I think, if there were some adjustments that were made. And so while it's currently written this way and we have the responsibility to enforce this, this is also a regulation change. So it's going to be easier for us to consider modifications to this and submit it through the regulation process. And so, but yeah, I think everyone is open to the idea that perhaps there could be a better method to accomplish the overall board's goal.
Additional feedback? People comfortable?
Yeah, I had listed, I might be limited here with my toddler, but I had listed before David listed off the qualifications, maybe a significant change of title within an organization, the changing of organizations completely, or the changing of a supervisor. But to David Anderson's point, not changing settings within an organization or things like that. But I like having language somewhere along those things and having a reminder sent out by the board to kind of do that.
Yeah, thank you, Josh. I think that is the other piece, is for the board to be kind of proactive and remind people, because, you review that at the time and then you get busy doing things and there are changes in your work environment. People aren't always cognizant of, man, I need to go back and look at my training plan and see the impact of this change and whether it's one that requires me to notify the board. Supervisors as well. I mean, it's also, important for them. They're the ones who are signing off on these training plans and being aware of if a change has occurred, to say to the person, like, this may be something you need to notify the board about.
I do want to share this too, since each of the advisory committees is discussing this, and this is perhaps not in every single profession, but most of them. I did reach out to some different associations that I talked to for the professions to see what the standardized supervision requirements are state to state. And unfortunately, this is a topic where there's really not a great deal of standardization. There are states that do many different things. Just as an example, one of the states that I talked to, they don't require there to be a training plan submitted in advance or approved. They just have people jump in and start accruing hours. And I think they turn them all in at the end and hope for the best. And that seems problematic at best. There's another state that requires hours to be submitted continuously. And so people have to log into an electronic system and submit hours throughout the entire process. And that seems a little tedious, in my opinion. But I did want to share that I did do a little research to try to see if perhaps there were other states that were all in line and perhaps we could make a modification to join what they're doing. But I think, unfortunately, this is one area that doesn't have a lot of standardization. So we do have some flexibility to try to do different things to accomplish this. But I think there's not one pattern that I can tell you we should definitely be doing this. I think there's things we can discuss and some different choices we can make on this.
Well, I think that list that you have was it had a good number of items that here are the possibilities, but that tends to be the, like, when you think, or when you all think back and review historic information where it's like, here are the errors we tend to see the most. I think that's fair to use that so that, like you said, it doesn't limit us to those, but it's like, these are like the top 3 or 4 that are common that we see that people forget to submit. So I think that's a great starting place. And then asking for feedback.
Anybody else want to weigh in?
would agree. It's just a balance. You don't want it to be too rigid and, but I mean, I understand the purpose of it.
Dave, is this enough to allow you to move forward with that, or do you need anything more specific from us?
No, if you wanted to make an official recommendation, you could. Otherwise, I think what we would note in the minutes was that there what appeared to be positive support for changes to the language to provide more flexibility for the board. And then also there was support like what you had mentioned before in terms of the agency sending reminders to individuals to provide that information to the board with more frequency. So.
Very good.
Hey, Leslie or David, I'm going to be joining on my phone here in a few minutes. So when you see me pop in, if you don't mind letting me in, that'd be great. Sorry about that. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
All right, that takes us to item C under old business, continued discussion on regs. We'll start with continuing education.
Yes, and so each of the advisory committees is reviewing their regulations to look to see if there's any updates that need to be made, if there's any outdated language that should be removed. One of the topics some of the other advisory committees have been discussing is whether there are items that should be included in the list under KAR 102-4-10A. That's the continuing education regulation for your profession. Under that regulation, item E has about 14 different items that would count for continuing education. And there are some in particular in terms of some of those items, but some of the advisory committees are discussing if those all should stay in the regulation or if some should be removed or if more language is added to provide more clarity on what specifically would count for those, or if there's any new items you believe should be added. Also, in terms of the number of continuing education hours, I did want to share, I've done a little bit of research. It is challenging for your profession. As I mentioned earlier, there's only about 17 states that license at the master's level. So while I was trying to do research on those programs, I was having a lot of difficulty finding the number of hours that they require. So what I did is I changed course and I looked at the PhD level licensed psychologist requirements for continuing education. And I did find pretty good information in terms of what is required in each state. I can tell you that the 50 hours that we require every 2 years is not the highest. There was another state that I believe required 60 hours every 2 years. However, the majority of states for the psychology programs require 40 hours every 2 years. I think of the states that I was able to identify, which was almost all 50, there were 25 states that require 40 hours every 2 years versus the 50 that we require. And concerning our neighbors, I did see that Missouri required 40 every 2 years, Oklahoma required 40 every 2 years, and Nebraska requires 24 every 2 years. So there is some variation between state to state, but the most common standard in terms of total number of hours every 2 years appears to be 40. So I wanted to share that with you too. The statute indicates that we would need to have 3 hours in ethics and currently the hours in diagnosis and treatment. But in terms of the total number of hours, that's not included in the statute, it's included in the regulation. So there is more flexibility if you wanted to modify the total number of hours too.
And Dave or Leslie, for the other master's level professions, social work, counselors, marriage and family therapy, what are their requirements?
So the LMFT and social work are 40. Counselors and addiction counselors, master's addiction counselors are 30.
Okay. So clearly
You have the same number as licensed psychologists.
yeah. And I would certainly recommend that we look at that, at least dropping that to 40. And then I notice in ours, it says 6 continuing hours in diagnosis and treatment. Does that automatically change with the change?
So the way that was worded was we didn't want to create any issues with people in their current license periods. So in the bill, that would change as of July 1st of 2025. And so we would need to put forward a regulation change to make this match that language. If there's a conflict, we would always go with the statute over the regulation. But since there's a 2-year window to implement that item, we'd probably want to modify this language to match what the statute says.
So, and if we need to do that change anyway, this was a good opportunity to take a look at this for other changes. I also wondered about number 8. That computerized interactive learning, that we differentiate between those that have a test and those that don't. But for some reason, if it has a test, you're not able to use all of the hours that way. So right now you can count 40 out of the 50, but you could have an additional 10 hours if there wasn't a test. I thought we had talked about this previously. Is there a reason for us not to allow people to do all their hours if there is a test, post-test for that training? Because as it stands now, they could do 40 out of the 50 with a post-test and then do 10 with no.
Yeah, I agree with that. Going over the document, I didn't know, it seemed odd that those numbers weren't aligned to me. So
This type of training would be recorded training or something that you would have to go through, like a FEMA training where it's already pre-done and then post-test to prove that you've gone through it?
Yeah, I think there are several online CEU services. Reliance, for example, is one our organization uses, and in order to get credit for the training, you have to take a test and pass at a certain level. If you take the test and you don't pass, then you don't get credit. You can retest. But it's a way of just saying that the person really paid attention to it and didn't just click through a online presentation while they were doing something else. And this is the test is a demonstration that they seem to have adequately absorbed the information and understood it.
It seems like there's 40 hours approved, 10 hours less than what you need. And I would suspect, or I'm guessing, the reason that they didn't increase it to 50 was to ensure that some of the training you went to was live.
I think as it reads, though, there's another, if you look at 9 under that, it's essentially the same type of training, but it doesn't include a post-test. So you could essentially do this all online. Is that right, Leslie?
Yes. So you can't have all 50 hours in post-test online training, but you can do the additional 10 hours by self-study or first time preparation and presentation, any other option. So yes, you could.
So, well, let's start with the first issue. Are we comfortable in recommending a drop to 40 hours to make us more consistent with the states around us as well as the other master's level professions?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Head nodding. Okay. Josh or Kari?
yes,
right. Dave, do we need a formal or just,
I think by consensus, there was support for making that change. So
all right. And I would recommend then that whatever that hour total is, that we change 8 for it to be the same. So that if a person, let's say, is working in a remote area, doesn't have opportunity to get to live events, could do all of their training online as long as it included a post-test. Everybody comfortable with that?
Definitely.
Yes.
I'm going to propose one technical change to those 2 items. As you notice there, it talks about completing a computerized interactive learning module, viewing a telecast or videotape, or listening to an audio tape. And perhaps that should be video recording or audio recording, since we've moved away from videotapes a few years back.
It's good to keep us up the correct technical jargon, Dave.
You're showing your youth, Dave.
That's right.
I mean, if people still want to watch videotapes, that's perfectly fine, but Blockbuster closed several years ago.
Are there other specific items under 102.410A that people think need to be adjusted? Obviously, according to the fact that we're recommending 40 hours, each of those that discusses the total number of hours required would need to be adjusted from 50 to 40, but are there other?
This may seem like a very small thing, but when I was renewing my licensure this past cycle, I know the diagnosis and treatment is being decreased to 3. So this might be small and insignificant, and that's fine. But I would feel much better if it said diagnosis or treatment, because like, what if you go to a training and it doesn't really, like, it's just purely about diagnosing autism and really not about treatment? And I don't know, me personally, that just kind of caught me up when I was renewing this past cycle and really thinking about, well, was it diagnosis and treatment? Was it just treatment? I think most treatment trainings have a component of some sort of diagnosis in it, but it just seemed, I don't know, that's how I interpreted it. And it was stressful for a small period of time.
I think that's a good catch.
I think that may be an issue, though, because I believe the language in the statute would still say diagnosis and treatment. So I think, yeah, so we would probably want to be consistent with what the statute currently says on that topic, unfortunately.
Yeah. I would assume that flexibility there from the board. I mean, again, there's a lot of overlap, but it is just one of those things where I would hope if you went to a full day training on diagnosing autism, it would still count towards that. So
One thing that some people have, and so some professions have and some don't, or they're adding, is receiving supervision. You have the option to provide supervision to students, practicum students, but an LMLP does not have. They could, in some professions, including psychology, they can get hours for receiving supervision as well. So I just thought I'd put that out there for you.
I like that, Leslie. I feel like a lot of times, like even just with consultations with other practitioners, I feel like I learn a lot in those types of settings. So it makes sense that you could receive hours that way. How to quantify, because it happens all the time, brainstorming and working with other clinicians. But the supervision piece is definitely a huge learning opportunity. So I can see that being beneficial.
For the,
Other people have thoughts on that?
and just in terms of the numbers for the licensed psychology profession, they're items that concern providing supervision or receiving supervision are limited to 15 hours per license period.
Sorry, my phone was ringing. When you finish discussing about receiving supervision, I want to add something, ask something else.
Is there other feedback on supervision, or are we comfortable with the recommendation? Looks like yes, Dave.
Okay, and just for clarity, is there consensus to add language first for providing supervision, and then second as a separate category that you could earn receiving supervision? Okay.
And so the maximum in your regulation are based on 50 hours? Do you want them brought down so that they match the maximum for those who have only 40 hours of CEUs? Okay.
Yeah, I think that seems consistent. Was that your question?
Yes.
All right.
I didn't want to forget it, if I start talking about something else.
Anything else under that continuing education reg that we want to provide any feedback on? All right. Is that all you need from us on that, Dave?
Yes, I believe that should be good.
All right, then we'll move on to documentation for continuing education.
And this is the short companion regulation. It's KAR 102-4-11A. And it basically is meant to help the licensing agency to provide more guidance, and it helps the applicants as well in terms of what would be sufficient to demonstrate that they had completed those continuing education hours too. So it doesn't track one-to-one exactly from the previous regulation, but this is meant to help let applicants know what they would need to submit to show proof of completing those hours. And then this is something that we can use here at the office to verify those things too. So the question is, since this was last updated back in 1997, are there items that are maybe outdated? Are there items that maybe didn't even exist last time this regulation was updated that should be added in here that you can think would be helpful?
Is there any way you could share that document?
Yes, I can do that.
I have it in front of me, but I have all that.
I'll share my screen. Okay, yes, this is KAR 102-4-11A, documentation for continuing education. It's a fairly short regulation, but it is meant to be a companion of the previous one.
My only thought with it was there are some junctures where it says a letter from a sponsoring organization. I think an email would suffice.
I've always had a question on the supervision of documenting that it says written verification. Is that just a statement, or like, do you need the whole log of hours and specific stuff around that?
So in some professions, the university, if you're an on-site practicum supervisor and not part of the university, they will send you a letter stating that you supervise practicum students and how many hours of CEUs that you earned. Also, if you're providing supervision, if the university couldn't, then we would ask that the dates of supervision be included in the letter. So that should be something that's signed by you and the supervisee with the dates of supervision.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful to add. I've always been a little unclear. I've never gotten one from a university, but I've never asked specifically. So I've always done it with a student, and I try to go overboard than under. So I never knew exactly what to put.
For item J, there's the similar modification to change video tapes to video recordings and then audio tapes to audio recordings. Probably.
Any other recommendations?
Dave, both Daves. I forgot to mention in the LMLP continuing education regulation, there is self-directed learning projects pre-approved by the board. I have only approved that 2 or 3 times since I've been here, and there's no clear standards for what that should be or how that should look. And other professions are looking at removing that. Would you be opposed to removing that?
It seems like, given all the opportunities there are for training online that are available to people, that seems like a category I'd certainly be comfortable with eliminating. Other folks?
I agree. There's enough other areas to do a variety of things that seems, overboard.
So then in the documentation, we would remove I.
Correct.
But there's not. If someone is reading a book or a psychology article, I don't think there's anything in here that speaks to that in documentation. The psychologists talked about that last night and said if it's self-study, like reading a book, or things that don't have a post-test, that you either provide a certificate, or if you're reading the title, the number of pages, a summary of the book. Is that something you would be interested in adding?
Is that like under D there?
Well, that's, I think if you wrote it.
Oh,
But
okay.
if you read it, I don't think you have anything in here.
So would a similar adding something but indicating having read but including that same material, would that be?
Well, we wouldn't, but if they read the whole book, we wouldn't want a copy of it. So just a summary of it, maybe.
Send a copy of the book, all the pages where they underlined things.
Right?
How many self-directed projects proposals do you all get? Curiously.
You mean what we were talking about before, or right now reading and stuff?
Oh, I thought it was kind of the same thing. I apologize.
No, the self-directed learning projects, we don't get very many at all. I haven't got any in years. But when they're allowed to read for us, or, you know, do things without a post-test online, but they don't have to get pre-approval from us for that. They just do that, and we just have to, a lot of people count reading.
Anything else in regard to that? Clean it up for you, Leslie? If we put the language together like you did for the licensed psychologists.
Mm-hmm. And I'll put it in when we bring it back.
Perfect. Thank you.
I have another question on the, I think it's covered in K, but like on the quality care activities, that just needs a signed statement, like from someone that you did that. And again, would you need dates around that, or any more details other than a signed statement?
I don't.
I'm just thinking of it like here we would do utilization reviews on charts. And so would I just like, would a letter from a supervisor suffice that? Or would you, again, like with the supervision, need the dates of when you completed those?
You know, I don't know what we normally get, but it might be good to have the dates. I think last night, Dave, weren't they saying that they talked about hold on a second, I have to look at your reg to get the right wording. Treatment utilization reviews. That you might not have the dates for that. Do you remember that, Dave?
I don't, sorry.
Okay.
Would it suffice to have a statement that just indicated the total number of hours of participation instead of the specific dates? Would that help, Iris?
Yeah, I just didn't know how specific the board wanted those to be.
I think the dates are critical in order to ensure that it's in that time frame for your licensing. You're supposed to be after you prior date of licensing.
So if the statement included the person had completed this number of hours between the dates of, Would that suffice? Or do they need the specific dates and hours for each of those?
Well, I'm thinking about supervision or those that are providing supervision. That can include weekly, an hour every week. And that's a lot of dates to include in there. I think a total number of hours is provided in the dates that this encompassed. If it was for a year or 2 years, but not every specific time that they had that meeting.
I agree. It could get overwhelming to have to, I mean, I think if you're meeting once a week or once a month or whatever, a lot, and most people that I work with seem to be pretty organized with their CEUs just because they want to have it all prepared. So of course, when your start date and your end date is. I think just the number of hours would be within that time frame would be sufficient.
What do you think, Leslie?
Time frame, dates, and total hours.
Are we ready to move on? I'm cognizant that we are getting short on time. That takes us to the next reg on the use of computerized psychological tests.
And Dave, if it's okay with you, maybe it would be good to pause here because I'm not sure how long this particular item will take, but I want to make sure you have enough time to discuss recommendations on adding new advisory committee members. So maybe we can, if it's okay with you, move to that item and then come back to this after that if there's time allowed in the meeting.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Everybody have an opportunity to review the letters of interest and resumes of those people who indicated desire to be appointed to this advisory committee, and any recommendations. One of the things we're asked to do is to kind of balance that from a number of perspectives. And Dave, you want to talk about those categories?
Sure. So there is an advisory committee policy that has some language in that policy that talks a little bit about the process by adding new members to the advisory committee. So officially, it is the chair of the board that has authority to appoint new members to the advisory committee. And as you're aware, advisory committee members serve 2-year terms. There is information in the advisory committee policy that says the policies and procedures under which the BSRB board members are expected to operate will also apply to the advisory committee members. So when you think about things like, avoiding conflicts of interest and, being good board members, think about those in terms of what some of these individuals might be able to provide to the advisory committees. And also in terms of the selection, the language in the advisory committee policy says, in reviewing nominations, the committee should work to ensure there is diverse representation, including but not limited to geographic setting, gender, culture, and ethnicity. It says that members should provide representation of the levels of licensing for that discipline, and those members should be selected from among public and private practitioners and educators. And so I did provide information to all of you in terms of their letters of interest and resumes. The advisory committee policy says there will be a public discussion at a meeting like this, and your determination of recommendations for new members will be made publicly. And then after you make recommendations, what I'll do is I'll summarize those in a letter and have Dave review that and approve it. And then it will be forwarded to the chair for review and consideration. But you did receive the materials from all of the applicants. I believe at the last meeting, there was also a desire to know if any of those individuals had applied for consideration in the past. And there was one member who had applied for consideration in the past. So I did note that when I sent out the materials to you. And in the past, people have asked a little bit about what process has to be used to identify recommended individuals, and there's not a specific process that you have to use, but what I've seen most advisory committees do is to have discussions and discuss the individuals that stood out to you the most. And in terms of the advisory committee policy, it says you'll have a minimum of 3 non-board members on the advisory committee, a maximum of 10. You currently have 6 non-board members on the advisory committee, so you could add as many as 4 if you chose to do so, but it talks about the value in having appointments staggered so that not everybody comes up at the same time. So with that, I'll turn it over to you and your discussion on these potential applicants.
Very good. Let's start with how many. Does it make sense for us to add 2 this time?
I think 2 would be good. It would help us get quorum if some of us are out.
Okay. Everybody else comfortable with 2?
Yes.
All right. So now that we have the number, we can talk about who you all think would be good folks to add to this advisory committee, given the criteria Dave just talked about. So, floor is open.
I really, I mean, they were all really good applicants, but I think the 3 that stuck out to me the most, Bruce was one. Jennifer, who has got her LBA and BCBA, is one, just because of that background. It's a little bit different than the rest of ours currently. And then Chantel. They're all pretty diverse as far as their backgrounds, a little bit different than a lot of our backgrounds as well. And then Chantel, because she's previously applied to, I thought that was a good indicator of her interest in investment.
Yeah, I agree. I thought Bruce, really great applicant, really diverse resume. I think his experience in the working with military populations as well, which I thought was neat. And just a really diverse background, has done advocacy work with LGBTQ groups and all that. So really important. I like Chantel's as well. I didn't catch the BCBA thing there with Jennifer, but I think that would be great as well. So.
Bruce has also stuck out to me as just, wow, I like a long variety, a lot of good experience. So I think that would be awesome.
I thought Bruce was a very good applicant as well. Just, there was a lot of personal experience that I think was valuable. I also enjoyed Robert Pedroza, primarily because he's from the Department of Corrections, and that's a very large field that we could use some representation in. And I thought that would be a helpful member to add as well.
I agree with that, because I started talking with an LMLP recently that works at one of our prisons, and I was pretty shocked to learn about just how they do things differently, from inpatient and outpatient work. So I think that would be great too.
Rebecca, do you have any?
I was reading through these and I'm like, oh, that's cool. Oh, I like that about this one. Or, oh, that's an awesome experience. Or I liked how Bruce was very open and shared some personal stuff. Like, I think they're all great applicants. I think it was hard for me to say which one stuck out the most. I did, for some reason, Robert's stuck out a little bit more than others. But if I had to pinpoint why, I don't know if I could exactly tell you. I think it's just what he's doing now that stood out to me. And I did like, I wasn't sure, I couldn't remember if we had anybody on the board currently that was the BCBA certified. That stuck out to me with Jennifer, with Ginger and the addictions. That was something that I'm not familiar with, and I don't do very often. So that stood out to me with Ginger's application. This is so definitely a difficult decision when you've got some really qualified people that are interested. So I think Bruce definitely stood out to me as well. And I heard that from several others, just the openness and the willingness to share experience and the interest that he had.
Donna?
I would say Bruce definitely stood out to me. And then it was a toss-up. I don't know that I had anyone. Each of them had something that I kind of liked. So I really can't pick a second one. So whoever wants to, I'd go along with whoever.
Am I correct in assuming that it's kind of a consensus around at least Bruce? Everybody comfortable with that? Seemed to be the name I heard most frequently.
Yes.
Okay, so that's one. And then after that, there was a lot of diversity in what people saw as the strengths of, I think, as somebody mentioned, a really good field of applicants. Do we want to vote, or how do we want to do that?
I have more of a question, I think, for everybody I wanted to pose. So I'm an autism specialist, but is there anybody else on the board that's a behaviorist? And the reason I ask is just because, we know that psychology is such a diverse field as far as specialties. And I think everybody is right. We had some really great candidates this round, but I think that's one area that, addictions, we don't have, if we don't have anybody in that area either. So but I think if we don't have a behaviorist, I would be leaning towards, I think maybe that, and somebody in addictions, if we don't have anybody in addictions either.
And I'll just add a comment here. I know that you had already come to a consensus of adding 2 individuals. You do currently have an even number of advisory committee members, which does create a little bit of trickiness in terms of quorum. So having an odd number could be helpful. As I mentioned, you have the authority to add up to 4 people, and it sounds like there's been a lot of positive comments about all these applicants. So just want to remind you, if you do want to add 3 instead of 2, you do have that flexibility. But ultimately, I definitely defer to your comments in terms of how you want this to be structured.
All right, then we can back up. We had originally decided to add 2, but to Dave's point, in terms of having an odd number, that would either need 1 or 3.
I'd be fine with
it. Go ahead.
So I'd be fine with 3.
Yeah, it sounded like people felt like because of how strong this group of candidates was, it probably makes more sense to go with 3 than 1. So let's see if we have a consensus on that. Everybody fine with that? Anybody uncomfortable? Looks like okay. So now we're going to go 3. So we got Bruce. That leaves with 2 more.
I think for me, the other top 2 would be Robert and Jennifer. But
Okay, others?
I would agree with that. Mine would be the same.
And I'll be the 3rd on that with Robert's background and corrections. I think that would be good based on what Travis was saying about that population and how big the Department of Corrections is. I think those 2 would be great.
Anybody?
I'm good with that.
Okay, anybody want to throw someone else in there? We're rapidly moving towards a consensus. Josh?
I'm good with that too.
Okay, so a slate of Bruce, Jennifer, and Robert. Everybody comfortable with that?
Yes.
Okay. Do we need formal action on that, Dave, or is that enough?
It appears to be the consensus for those 3, so you don't need to take an official vote. I think go ahead and summarize that recommendation, and then Dave, I will send you a message with kind of that written up in a more formal process, and then you can review that and let me know if it reflects the advisory committee's recommendation.
Very good. All right, let's back up to the regulation KAR 102-4-13, use of computerized psychological tests. And I know one of the reasons Dave brought this to our attention is because it refers to the standards for educational and psychological testing from the APA 1985, reprinted in 1996. Since that time, there's an updated version in 2014. And I had an opportunity to review that. It's quite extensive, a couple hundred pages. Computerized testing is referenced in the glossary 8 or 9 times, but spread out throughout the document. And as I reviewed those pages, it became clear to me that it is such a accepted part of doing evaluations and assessments now that it doesn't have its own section. It's just mentioned in a number of sections, almost all kind of talking about making sure that it's a good fit for what's being asked or the person who is being assessed, that it's being held to the same standard, that people are making sure people can utilize both the equipment and understand the information being presented to them. So it seemed still pretty close with the information in this particular regulation. Did anybody experience or have other thoughts on that?
No.
So we definitely want to update the reference to the standards for educational psychological testing. Are there other modifications people saw that they thought were important?
You have a question for you, and I'm curious, you all as professionals. In item number 5, it talks about, so in item B, it says to utilize computers in any aspect of psychological testing, the master's level psychologist should also meet the following requirements. Number 5 says, make an explicit statement concerning the report as to whether or not the master's level psychologist has seen or examined the client in person. This was last updated back in 1997. So the idea you could have any kind of interaction by screen probably was not envisioned when these were written or updated. So should there be a distinction about if you've seen the client in person or a different format, or do you think that would be helpful for something like this?
I think in person. So when I think of in person, I mean, well, and there's a few ways I think it could be looked at, but to me, it's very different when it's face-to-face in person in Zoom versus like telephonic, for instance. Or if, you're only sending them like a questionnaire via computer, electronic source, and you don't actually interface with them, where you're getting any sort of like read on body language, eye contact, some of those behavioral observations. I'd be curious to see what other people think, but I think if we delineated the difference between some form of face-to-face versus, absolutely no interaction, that would be good, especially given that 1997, a lot has changed in the past almost 30 years.
I agree. I think making the statement of face-to-face is important, because I've got some people that, they live far away or they don't have transportation. So we do online. But I know them quite well and we face-to-face every week. So I think making it the statement of face-to-face contact, or I like what you said.
Anybody else want to weigh in quickly?
It does seem important that you would actually have more than a telephone call. It seems important that you would actually have to have some way of visually seeing the person. And being televideo, you at least would visually see that person to, verify some of the information that they're telling you, and that person is the one that's, taking the test or completing it. Somehow to be technical, to allow televideo, but not so liberal as to allow, a simple phone call.
Yeah, and I think in the standards for the provision of services, televideo is considered face-to-face. But I don't know. Some services are being allowed to be provided telephonically, but it is generally listed like that, not falling under the same overall kind of criteria as face-to-face. All right, we're rapidly running out of time. Does that help, Dave?
It does. We'll go ahead and mark this up and bring it back. And if there's any further comments, we can adopt them at the next meeting.
Perfect. As Dave mentioned, you've got a copy of all the modifications to the unprofessional conduct regulations from the other professions. So if you're taking an opportunity to review that, we'll add it to our agenda for our next meeting, which, Dave, we send out a doodle poll occurring sometime in August.
Yes.
All right. Right under the wire. Well done, all. Thank you very much for your participation. Very good meeting. Appreciate your willingness to continue to serve. Hope you have a great rest of your week. We'll
Thank
see you
you.
in August.
All right. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.